Okay, first of all, Dungeons and Dragons, art and Arcana, amazing. I remember you sent me this book and it showed up. And I look, here's the thing. I was sitting with this book and all I saw on your social media was the cover. I was not prepared for when the delivery guy hands me this book and like this, I couldn't believe it. Cracked it open. I've been like just obsessed with this book ever since. So the first question I got to ask is, why did you do this? What was the kind of the spark that said this is a project we should undertake? What was that?
We love D&D, lifelong fans, all of us. I got back into playing D&D in 5th edition. Our missing member, Sam Witwer, was my Star Wars game master, and Sam took an awesome job, and he couldn't continue being our game master. I didn't want to cheat on the group, so I started playing D&D again in 5th edition. And this was about 2.5 years ago. And I immediately was looking for the book. Like, what did I miss over the past few years? There is no book. There was nothing comprehensive. There was nothing definitive. There was nothing as substantial that took you through the history and the art. And I called Michael, and I was a fan of Michael's book, Empire of Imagination. And
about Gary Gygax.
Oh, that's right. A biography about Gary Gygax and kind of how the whole thing came about.
Fantastic book. And I was a fan, and I said, are you interested in doing a D&D book, a history book, an art book? I don't know what exactly it'll be, but probably more of an art book that showcases all this great fantasy illustration. And he was in, and we just started forming the team. And that's when Michael reached out to Jon Peterson, who I had never met, but I'd heard of. And Jon Peterson is, we think, and I think everyone would agree, the foremost historian on role-playing games. So Jon joined the party, and
we needed a barbarian, so of course we had to bring in Sam to serve that role. And we all had very different points of view on the game. We all played different parts of it. We all thought differently about the game, even how we play. And that became really effective when you think about how you to piece together something so comprehensive. Jon approached it from a very, very long-term historical standpoint. Sam is very experiential in his play. He was always a dungeon master and a game master, so he brought a very kind of emotional, experiential part. I'm a bit of a generalist. I was kind of the bard. I think I tried to pull together pieces. And then Kyle, is a visual storyteller as a director. So he really understands how the flow of this thing really needs to work. So it really proved to be kind of a perfect mix of this balanced party idea that we talk about.
John, what I'm curious about is when you're looking at the history of the game, you're talking decades and decades and decades. This could be volume 1 of 10. As you're like exploring the history and you guys are trying to decide what are the things that we need to put in here, what are the things that we can put aside, what for you kind of became your benchmark for this is the piece of history we need to put in?
So certainly, and we vetted thousands and thousands of images. Obviously you would, because we aren't just looking at art. We're looking at character sheets, we're looking at dice, we're looking at pristine pictures of product, right? And we came down, I think, eventually to the idea that the things that were most iconic for the brand were typically the things that had been on the biggest products, right? Yeah. And then we wanted to be able to show kind of behind the scenes how they came to be the way they are, why they were the way they are, what were the forces in the industry and within the design teams and so on that transformed the brand over the years. And some of this was external social pressure, some of this was competition with other games and things like that. But that, I think, let us develop a spine that kind of told this 45-year story. And then we just took that collection, this immense collection of thousands of images, and kind of pieced together, okay, this seems to slot in with this. And we know everyone loves the big wraparound covers of the original AD&D books, the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, and Dungeon Master's Guide. Those are our highest priorities. Let's make sure we find the original art for those and get them into the book.
It was like decorating a Christmas tree. We wanted to have like the perfect tree first. It had to have the right shape. It had to fit in the room because we had limitations on how big it could be, how many images, how many words. Obviously, like you said, it could have been so many more volumes. Yeah. And there was so much left on the cutting room floor. And then you go and you layer it up in a themed way. And we said, we want to not just do the prettiest stuff. It can't just be the most beautiful art. That's not what this is about. This is about how did the game adapt, evolve, survive through all these editions, and why? What is the art that transcended? What are the underpinning visuals within these characters that survived through iterations? And getting into the who as well. Who in terms of in the universe of D&D, there's that history. Who are these characters? How did they come about? What is their story history, fictional, and what is the history behind the people, the pillars of the brand that created it and took it up through these iterations. So there were so many layers, and then we had to curate it. So it's very curated. Right. It wasn't just, oh, we all like this art. It was, yes, this art is good. yes, this art is important. What is the story behind this art? And how does that art then sit in tandem with other art? How do they sit on a page in juxtaposition? What story do they start telling together when you put two things together? There's a good panel in there where we get into advertising. And how did the brand sell itself? And how was it perceived? And how did it wish to be perceived? And it's a catalog from 1981 product catalog and a 1982 product catalog. And one is heavily featuring demonic Satan type door. And the next one features happy-go-lucky Morley, the wizard.
Yeah.
And that's 1 year apart. And so putting those two together tells a greater story than you could even use with words. That's the visual storytelling of some of this. So.
It's amazing hearing you talk about it because you can so tell you're a director. As it's hearing you like unfold the story of the book.
But we're all story. It's a story, and we had to agree. What is the narrative? Who is the star? Who's the central character of the book? And the star is Dungeons and Dragons. And they do have famous characters, but everyone knows Dungeons and Dragons. They don't necessarily know Drizzt or Elminster. If you play it, you do, but they haven't transcended that to mainstream.
Right.
So the star is D&D. And I think that's what we've all focused on and agreed that that's the story we want to tell.
Michael, who would you say when you guys are sitting down and you're gathering this incredible art, you're finding this incredible history, you're telling this great story? At the end of the day, when you look back now, the book is published. Who is this book for? Like when you guys are sitting there thinking about this and piecing this together, who in your head was this book really targeted for?
That's a good question. I think there's a few answers. Firstly, it's for us. We wrote the book we wanted to buy.
Right.
Which is one reason why we literally spared no expense. If we had a lesser capture of a particular image, but we could spend a lot of money to get a little bit better capture, we did. I mean, it really came down to that. I mean, transparently, we were contracted on a base level to do a book of roughly 350 pages, maybe 35,000 words, 300, 400 images. The book has got 700 images. It's 450 pages. We worked with the publisher, and they were awesome with us, realizing they were making a more and more expensive product they wouldn't be able to charge for, as it were. But this was about getting the one chance to tell the story of D&D from beginning to end, and getting a story that's for everybody, anyone that's ever played the game. So to answer your question on a more broad level, it's for anyone who's ever played D&D or anyone who's ever been curious about D&D or even fantasy art. That book has got something in there for everyone. And my hope is that while D&D is exploding right now, there's a lot of people that are playing the game and picking it up in the last 3, 4, 5 years will have an interest in what's happening and what happened 40 years ago and realize there's a tremendous rich history about this game that I think actually makes the act of playing richer. To know that Drizzt is not new. To know that when you play The Curse of Strahd, that Strahd is a character that goes back to 1982.
Right.
And there's a lot of iterations. So I just think that's a really, really fun, rich, interesting history. And I think the way it's affected pop culture is a whole other layer about kind of why this history is becoming more and more important today.
Well, you're mentioning the effect it has on pop culture and like the resurgence of the game. Kyle, I remember my first introduction to you was you had just done Fanboys, and we had a mutual friend that you signed a poster of Fanboys and sent it over through our mutual friend to kind of celebrate me finishing my first little indie film. And from there, I got turned on to you as a storyteller and following through other stuff. Just last year, you had Barely Lethal out and all that stuff. But as a storyteller, looking at the narrative of the history of Dungeons and Dragons and where it's come, it was popular one time. It kind of went off to the shadows a little bit. You had the emergence of things like Pathfinder and things like that. What is the narrative path that has led us to this place now that Dungeons and Dragons today is now, it's not just having resurgence, it is really more popular today than it has ever been. What has brought us to that place culturally, the natural progression of the brand itself? Why are we here right now?
A lot of things that were inspired or given license to exist because of Dungeons & Dragons, other creative franchises have taken off, captured the imagination. So you have Lord of the Rings, obviously incredibly successful. Game of Thrones and Harry Potter, people are open to the fantasy and spells and all these great things. And it was a prime time for Dungeons & Dragons to go back and look at what did we do? What did we do best over all the years? Let's not compete with video games. Let's not compete with these things. We're really a community, a collaborative storytelling game. Let's go back to analog. Let's sell this as that experience. And that's what 5th edition did best. I don't think they said, let's start a digital revolution where everyone's going to stream their games. That just happened. And they were smart enough to harness it and say, wow, we can showcase people playing it. And now we have a way to make people feel like it's easy to get into it. You don't have to read a heavy, big book. You don't have to come with years of experience having played in the 80s. You could watch a 5-minute YouTube video, learn the basics of the game, and hop right in and just say, oh, I want to do this, and roll dice. And it's that easy. It's literally that easy. But those barriers are broken, and the stigma is stripped away because of the success of all these other franchises that, were in D&D influenced.
Yeah.
I mean, back in the 1970s, things like hit points and experience points and
Leveling
levels
up.
and
Yeah.
all these things, these were arcane concepts. They were very novel.
And they're embedded in just about
But
everything
now,
these
you can't
days.
grow up these days without playing computer games that teach you that from a young age. And I think what people connect with now is that they've grown up with those kinds of tools. And then there's this other original analog tool that same technology, things like hit points and experience and so on, can be applied to, where you can then tell your own story. Right? I mean, I love the big AAA video games. I love Witcher 3. I love Fallout 4. But, when you sit down around a table with 5 of your friends, you get to play the game that only you guys need to like, right? Yeah. And the big tent poles can't target that narrowly, and they can't engage you creatively the same way.
Like, what is League of Legends? It's a minis game.
Right.
And all these things are based on the principles of Dungeons and Dragons, which you're right. It was so foreign. And now we take it for granted. Zelda, all these things, like characters that level up, gain experience. And I think everyone's so accustomed to these concepts. So like, oh, I've kind of been playing D&D my whole life, but just doing it with all these other copycats.
Yeah.
So that's why it's a no-brainer that it's exploded, because now it's easy to be exposed to it and you're already familiar with how to do it.
Last night in West Hollywood, you guys had an event celebrating the release of the book, and you had Sam was there as well as your co-author as well. Joe Manganiello was there, who wrote the foreword for me. And one of the things that you guys talked about that really, I think, impacted me a lot was the notion that this is about, in a sense, getting social again. This is a game that you don't sit in your basement and play by yourself with some other people in Europe or whatever. I can't remember something. This is different than having your ass kicked by a 12-year-old from Germany who's killing you every step of the way. But the notion about actually getting your friends together again, sitting down together and playing a game, that's the part that really appealed to my wife and got her into the game. Talk about like the impact that a game like D&D has. I mean, even on you guys individuals, because you guys told some great stories about that as well, the importance of that aspect of it.
Well, very important for me was, it was one of those important properties like Star Wars and like, I was a big Marvel Comics fan. That's how I learned how to draw. My entry into storytelling and filmmaking was drawing, and I did all my own storyboards, and I learned that craft through reading things like the Monster Manual, flipping through, being inspired by what was going on in Spider-Man and trying to draw like the greats and Ralph McQuarrie's and all these great concept artists. And D&D was one of those, I think, the 3 pillars for me of great, original, fresh design, all types of styles. You'd see comedic art, you'd see editorial type stuff, you'd see really serious, beautiful fantasy paintings, all like just in Dragon Magazine alone. So those things were so important and just inspired me as a storyteller. And I think that's what it's continuing to do. I think that's the other thing. People come into D&D and like, I can do anything. All I need is my imagination and an open mind. And literally the story can go anywhere that any other media can't provide.
And John, I feel like we are starting to just feel the effects of social isolation. Some people think it's caused by these digital devices we're all holding, right? And there's a lot of studies that are starting to show that people are really, really craving real personal attention, interpersonal relationships that are physical and tangible. For whatever reason, which is ironic, right? Because we are more connected than we've ever been with people all around the globe, and yet there's something about being face-to-face that is a really different experience. And D&D provides that. In fact, it provides that, and it gives you a reason to keep coming back to it on a weekly basis or a monthly basis with your friends.
You can murder kobolds together with your friends, rather than online.
It's funny though, because the D&D experience is so rich. I think one reason is because I'm sure all of us as D&D players all tell stories about that time we went and stormed that dungeon and did this thing. What a weird conversation to have. In a shared imaginary realm, we have this shared memory. And it provides a richness of relationship that I think standard relationships don't usually get. And you actually get to see aspects of your friends that you wouldn't otherwise see. Oh, I get to see Kyle play an angry dwarf.
Like a barrier breaker.
With
people, like sometimes you can't find that commonality, but because you're transported somewhere else, it's like, some people are like, I need alcohol before I'll do karaoke, It's like D&D is the alcohol, I guess, for people. Then they're like, oh, everyone's saying crazy stuff. I'll just do this too. And then you bond over this original story.
And there's a sort of creative process that's unlocked by having the equal footing of participants. It doesn't really matter who the DM is. Everybody who's there is shaping this story.
Right.
And the way that there's something that unlocks that really had never been unlocked before D&D, right? And like it leads to kind of creative leaps that are so counterintuitive that, it's almost like a Ouija board, right? Where that you're all pushing on and it spells something out and you're all pushing maybe in different directions without really knowing it. Yeah. And that magical process is what it unlocks for me that I'm so fascinated by.
It's like rules, but the rules, when you really get down to it, they're just rules to get you to think freely and unlock, like he's saying. I think that's what it is, like, because every game is different. So it's just the idea is come and this is some guidelines for you to then go do anything you can imagine.
I can't remember if it was one of you guys or was Sam last night said, yeah, it's a game. You can do anything. You come up with anything. Just roll for it. And that kind of became the thing. Well, listen, guys, first of all, thank you for making this book, not only for people who don't know much about Dungeons & Dragons or do know a lot about it. It's incredibly informative, the rich history in there. It's such an enjoyment thing to read. But from a personal perspective here, thank you for giving me this tool that let me have several hours of just revisiting some amazing memories I had as a kid playing this game. It's just incredible. Guys, this book is available right now. It is Dungeons & Dragons, Art and Arcana by these incredible guys. Check it out. It's available now. You have to have this. Whether you play D&D or not, a little bit of a warning though, you're going to start playing D&D once you start flipping through this, guys. Guys, thanks so much for being here and thank you for this book.
Thank you, John.